What is poverty? Why do some people have more, while others have less? And how exactly is it related to our health? In the most basic sense, poverty can be summed up as a lack of resources. Not enough food on the table, not enough money in one's wallet, not enough money to buy a wallet. There are two main reasons for a lack of resources. The first one is too little income, too little money being earned. The second one is too much expenses, too many debts, too much going out while not enough coming in. Now let's address the first reason. The lack of income, or the restriction on the amount of income, is of course related to either the second or the 11th houses. Astrologically speaking, the second house is our family, our values, our valuables, our mouth, including our teeth, and what we eat. Now, when the second house lord is extremely weak or afflicted by malefics, or the second house itself is under a heavy influence of Saturn, then this can indicate a lack of income or a very restricted income, and as a result, poverty. Now, as mentioned before, the second house also represents teeth, and as such, usually one can see a correlation between financial difficulties and teeth problems. The 11th house, on the other hand, is quite a different matter altogether. It is less about your income and more about bonuses, one-time jobs, freelancing, things like that. As such, the 11th house is not an indicator of poverty in and of itself, but rather an indicator of any alternative income source that can alleviate that poverty. And in medicine, it is not an indicator of a problem, but rather the indicator of how easily one can cure certain problems. But more on that later. Now let's discuss the other side of the coin, which is too much expenditure. Now, that would of course be all about the 12th house of expenses and the 6th house of debts and responsibilities. Interestingly enough, the 6th house also represents the job we actually do in our everyday life. Again, a responsibility we have, and just like the second house, it is an indicator of our regular income. In fact, it is part of the karma triangle, which is the second house of our income itself, the 6th house of what we do to gain that income, and the 10th house, which is the position we occupy, and basically the job title we have. Now let's start with the 12th house. If it is extremely strong and under the influence of Jupiter, one can obviously expect quite a bit of expenditure. Now, that is actually the antithesis of poverty, because that indicates that there is a lot of income to have so much expenditure. But if there is a very weak 12th house, that might indicate a problem, because very little expenditure is correlated to very little income. Now, with that being said, the biggest problem one might encounter with the 12th house is not directly related to expenditure in and of itself, but rather, shall we say, just throwing money on bad things, for example, on bad habits, gambling, drugs, etc. And that is also seen in the dignity of the 12th house lord and in afflictions of the 12th house itself. The 12th house also represents isolation, such as being in a hospital, being in jail, even being abroad. Now, in these conditions, it is obviously far more difficult to have an income, and as such, far more difficult to have expenditure. Now, this should not be considered poverty in and of itself, because, again, under these conditions, the problems are far more severe than a simple lack. When it comes to the 6th house, this is not just the house of our work and our responsibility, but also it is considered the main house of diseases. In fact, it is the house that represents any form of duty we must perform and anything we are responsible for, including microorganisms living in our body. Now, one might ask, how are microorganisms related to poverty? And the answer is quite interesting, because if we look at what happens when a person doesn't have enough to eat, well, one of the symptoms is bloating. That is because in our guts, which are represented by the 6th house, we actually have bacterial colonies that are completely dependent on us for food, but are independent organisms. And when they don't receive enough to eat, they act out. That is the bloating we see. In fact, they are also often the cause of diseases, because, again, when there is an imbalance in our guts, the microorganisms that live there can become diseases, can turn pathogenic, to use a medical term. The connections between the 6th house and diseases don't end there, but let's refocus for a minute on the connection of the 6th house to poverty itself. You see, the main connection is expenses, as have been mentioned before, because the 6th house represents all of our responsibility, and as such, the bills we receive every month and the debts we incur. It would, for example, represent the mortgage one takes to pay for a house. Now, when one takes a mortgage, it is a huge expense which already ties up quite a bit of his income. And this is quite often a reason that a person might find himself in poverty, because he cannot pay his debts. Now, the same would go for children, because children are also a huge expense and will tie up a huge part of someone's income. These examples can be also extended to pets, to health issues, and quite a few other sources of debt that will affect a person's financial status. With that being said, one might actually regard the 6th house as being more important to the overall financial condition of most people than the second house, which represents the income itself. So when the sixth house lord is in an enemy sign or is debilitated, one can expect quite a bit of financial problems. But to actually get to the point where it is overwhelming, that would necessitate some other influence on the sixth house and the sixth house lord. Interestingly enough, when it comes to malefics in the sixth house, they usually have the opposite effect of what you would expect from a malefic. Instead of being an affliction on the sixth house, they can actually be a benefit to the native, because they show either the restriction or the destruction of debts, diseases, and other responsibilities which can tie a person down. Now, this of course can manifest in quite a negative way, but usually it actually means that a person can overcome his difficulties. More importantly, when it comes to overcoming the issues of the sixth house, one must look again at the 11th house, because the 11th is 6 from the 6. It represents cures to diseases, it represents the income that can nullify debts, and it represents achievements of ambitions which can negate previous responsibilities. For example, if one achieves a raise in his salary, which is by definition an achievement of one's ambition, then he is usually able to improve both his financial status and the handling ability of his responsibilities. To summarize, when it comes to poverty, it is either a matter of not enough income or too much expenses, and one must look at the 2nd, 6th, 12th or 11th houses to find out what is going on and how to fix it. I hope you found this video useful. Please like and subscribe, and if you wish to learn more about medical astrology and astrology in general, please check out my website. You will find the link below. Thank you.